Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's Tuesday Talks webinar. My name is Susan Brown, and I'm the Associate Director of Family Programs. It is a pleasure to be hosting a webinar on tonight's topic, Preparing for Winter Break and Fall 2020 Housing Selection. Joining us tonight is Shannon Walker. She is the Assistant Director of Housing Services. Shannon is going to do a short presentation, and then after the presentation, we will begin to take questions. Please keep in mind, we ask that you do refrain from asking personal questions pertaining to your student. At the end, we will give you an email address, and if you have questions pertaining to your student, we will be happy to answer them. So thank you, Shannon, for joining us tonight. This is a very popular topic, as you know.
Definitely. So again, I'm Shannon Walker. I'm the Assistant Director of Housing Services. And that's me. Thank you, Susan, for having us here today, for having me here. And if you're here as a NUN parent of a student who's currently abroad, this is for the housing for next year and for winter break. So if you're looking for that webinar, there was one a couple weeks ago. You can find that on the Parent Programs Tuesday Talk website. So we'll jump into what we're here for. So our agenda for today, we're going to go over the final exams and winter break schedule and some winter break housing information from our end. We'll talk about housing online and what the portal looks like for students. We'll talk about eligibility and the criteria for different types of students and their housing processes, the important dates and events, what housing options are available for different students, the Lightview public-private partnership that we have with American Campus Communities, the selection and placement process, keys to success, and if that wasn't enough, some question and answers at the end. All right. So first and foremost, we're getting up towards the end of the semester. So some important dates in the next few weeks. On December 4th is the last day of classes. December 5th is a reading day. December 6th through 13th are final exams. And December 15th is the first official day of winter break. Some important resources for you are your students' academic advisors, residential life, the university health and counseling services, and WeCare for any needs other than that. For winter break in the housing world, for first-year students, the current halls, most of them close over break. First-year students are not required to move out completely. They can leave their belongings in their room as long as they will be returning to the same space for the spring semester. Students will need to leave for break by December 13th at 7 p.m. and will be able to return to their space on January 5th. First-year students who are interested in staying over break can fill out the winter break housing form on their Housing Online. And their temporary spaces, if they are staying in a closed building, would be just a temp space, and they'd be able to bring anything that they need with them from their current space to that temporary option. For any student who needs to request a late departure or an early arrival for either semester, they can also fill out and request on the winter break housing and departure form on their Housing Online. So upper class students are a little bit different. The upper class halls do not close over break for any student with a continuing contract from fall to spring. So that's any student who's staying in the same space from fall to spring. So for the fall move out, is December 13th at 7 p.m., just like with the first-year students. If they would like to extend their stay past that, they would need to submit a departure form also on their Housing Online. If you're coming in fresh for the spring, that's January 5th is the first day to move in for both students on co-op and in classes. And if you need an early arrival for that, that's also through the arrival and departure forms on your Housing Online. So that's covering winter break, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about selection. So we already mentioned Housing Online once, but Housing Online is the main source of information and applications and any of these processes for students. They can get to that through their My Northeastern and services and links. You can find it by scrolling down to the Housing and Dining and Campus Services part. We also recommend that you favorite it as a link for future use so it shows up on the right side screen. And that will be where students will complete all of their applications, any extra forms, select housing, view their roommates, and basically anything that they need to do within our housing office. So before we talk about the actual selection process, we'll talk about eligibility. There is a difference for students between whether or not they are required, guaranteed, or not guaranteed housing for undergraduates. So rising second-year students, the current first years, are required to live for their first 2 years on campus in the university housing. They are then guaranteed for 4 years as long as they apply and deposit on time. And they're guaranteed a space and a selection number as long as they do that. Any student who is not guaranteed housing, if they're not accepted as a traditional student, or they've waived a housing in the past, will receive either a selection number or a waitlist number. And any student who misses the application deadlines could be on a waitlist, depending on when we reach capacity for each semester. All students who are interested in housing should apply for housing, and that leads us to our next slide, important dates and events. So this is a timeline of the process for next year. So starting on December 12th, the applications for fall 2020, spring 2021, and the summer terms will be available on Housing Online. The applications apply to all of our students regardless of where they are this semester, whether they're on campus for classes this year or whether they're on co-op. They're posted for everyone at that time. An email reminder will be sent to students and families to notify them that the applications are live. 4 terms that students can apply for are the fall, spring, and summer 1 and summer 2 terms for first-year students. The summer 1 term is called new term. And it's important that your student applies for any term and all terms that the students think they might need. It's especially important for fall and spring, as in the past, we've reached capacity in February, so if they don't apply by that January 17th deadline, they may be on a wait list. It's typically less likely that we would reach a wait list for the summer semesters. It's a little bit more flexible. We'd encourage your students to apply for all the terms, even if they're thinking about maybe doing a study abroad or a co-op outside of Boston. We have a pretty flexible cancellation policy, and if you've signed up for housing, it registers you for the email reminders for that term, but you wouldn't necessarily get them if you didn't apply. If you didn't apply, we'd think that you don't need that housing. We wouldn't communicate it to you in the future. So as always, it's safer to apply and then cancel than it is to apply last minute when we're potentially on a wait list. So all of these applications are due on January 17th. It's an extremely important deadline as it is a hard deadline. We will send some reminder emails to the students to make sure that they apply by that date and the status of each of their applications. After we receive the applications, we'll review the number of applicants and determine which students will receive a selection number and which students will receive a waitlist number for the students who are not guaranteed. And we'll release the selection and waitlist numbers on January 31st. The numbers are randomly generated based on their years on campus, not on their credits. So if your student is a second year on campus but has a credit of credits from high school that make them into a third-year student, they are still a second-year student. Upper class students who receive a selection number will need to make a $200 deposit by February 10th for any of the semesters that they apply for. So they do need to pay a $200 deposit for both fall and spring and the separate summer terms. It's important to note that it's not a bill. So the deposit doesn't show up on your billing statement. It is a separate payment that you'll need to log in and select each of them individually on the NU Pay tab. For second-year students, those rising second-year students who are current freshmen, since you're required to live on campus housing, the deposit would be waived. The housing and selection process, the selection and placement part of the process will begin February 19th for upper class students, so right before spring break. And for rising second years, you have a separate selection process, and that starts March 10th, the week after spring break. And both upperclassmen and current rising second years will be in the pause placement process, which takes place over the summer. All right. So before we talk a little bit more about actually selecting the housing, we'll talk a little bit about the variety of housing that's available to each of the different students. So below are a couple of examples of floor plans of apartments. We have both apartments and semi-private suites available to rising second years and upperclassmen. These floor plans that we have here are two of many, many different configurations that are available to students. Each of the students will be able to see more floor plans for specific buildings on their Housing Online. But these are just a few of those. So within those, there's 3 rate classes: economy, standard, and enhanced. In each of the apartment style options, there is a kitchen, so they are not required to have a meal plan. And some of them have a common space. So we can see which ones have those common spaces and a little bit of the breakdown based off of the prices here. So an economy rate does have a kitchen and unit, but it does not have a common space. The standard rate has an in-unit kitchen, and it does have a common space. And the enhanced one is an in-unit kitchen. It has a common space. They're typically a little bit newer buildings, and they often have elevators. And you can see a little bit of the examples of what those look like at the bottom. If you want to look at the rates and how those play out on our website, under the room rates page, you can find a very complex PDF of all of the different buildings and the different rates available in each building. It's a very useful thing for students to use prior to the selection process. So for suites, they do not have a kitchen, so they are required to have a meal plan. They're laid out as 2 bedrooms connected by a bathroom, type of Jack and Jill style. They don't have a common space, and they're typically, for the upper class and the rising second year students, 2 single rooms. There are a couple that are double rooms connected, but they're mostly singles, and those would be an International Village. So when it comes to options for upper class first, second years, they both have apartment and suite style options. They both have options in economy, standard, and enhanced prices. And they have a variety of options in apartment size based off of the number of students in each one. We do recommend that second year students look for roommate groups that are in sizes of 4 to 6. That's the most common option for their sizes, and we tend to keep their groups in that size and range. The upper class students also have more single rooms based off of seniority, and the second years have more options in the suite style living. We also have an option called the leased properties, which are buildings that are within university housing, but they offer students, we lease them through the university, and they offer students a style of living that it's a bit more like independent living. While they don't sign the lease themselves, they're not proctored, and they are more of a typical apartment, and they are an excellent option for students who are looking to seem like they're living in an off-campus lease but don't have to sign it themselves, and those are a part of the selection process. Another option for our upper class students is our public-private partnership with Lightview. So Lightview is a new project that we've had finished for this year, and it is a community that is run through American Campus Communities, and it is a partnership with the university. So it's affiliated with Northeastern, but it is not a part of our housing selection process. The students sign leases and are a part of that community, but it is primarily, if not completely, filled with Northeastern University students. It is only available to rising third-year students and above, so the students who are not required to live in university housing. It is competitive rates. It has fully furnished apartments, and they are accepting leases now for September 2020, and there's students living in it this year. If your student is curious about it, they do have a welcome center on Columbus Ave, and you can go in there and find out more information about how their process works. All right, so our actual selection process. So there are several parts of the housing selection and placement process. So for rising second years and for upperclassmen, there is both selection and placement. So the first part is group selection or individual general selection for upperclassmen students. In group selection, students in the group are required to fill an entire apartment and suite. So when you get your selection, when the students get their selection number, they'll have an assigned time to choose housing based off of that number. For first year rising second year students, they'll have a group selection time. For upperclassmen, they'll have both a group selection time and a general individual selection time. If you choose something in the first part in group selection as an upperclassman, you would not be able to participate in the second or third part of the process. As a rising second year, if you don't choose something during group selection, then you'd be eligible to be a part of the pause placement process. So with a group, a student in a group fills the entire apartment or suite. That means that if an apartment has 4 vacancies, a group must fill each of the 4 vacancies and have no remaining empty spaces to complete that part of the process. A group of 4 would only log in on that day and see options that have just 4 spaces available. A roommate group in this part of the selection process can be anything from a group of 1 who would fill something like a studio single, all the way up through our largest apartment options, which are 8 people. As a tip, we recommend that most second-year students form groups of 4 when selecting housing, as that is the most common capacity and configuration. The majority of our housing is selected during this group process, so it is a good idea for students to go in with multiple ideas and multiple different ways in which their group would fit into different group sizes and options. For upper class students, they'll have a second day where if they're trying to select by themselves. With upper class students, many students are breaking off from their friend groups as their friends break off to go on different co-op and study abroad semesters. So they tend to select by themselves, and in that case, during general and individual selection, they can go in and fill any vacancy that's still available at that time. And we don't have that for the rising second year selection, and that is because most rising second year students fill all of the vacancies available during selection during group selection, and there isn't anything available for during the general selection process. That doesn't mean that you can't choose housing by yourself. You don't have to be in a group. It just means that we'll place you during the pause placement process. So pause placement is a process that happens for any student who didn't select during selection after selection is over. Pause is a very routine part of our process. What happens is there's more students with selection numbers than there are spaces available during selection. This is because a vast majority of students, not majority, a vast amount of students cancel their housing between selection and the end of the semester. So in May and June, they get co-ops and study abroads, and we want to support those students in choosing the housing that they need, but if they were going to be here, but then also support them in any of their new opportunities that they have moving forward. So we anticipate a certain number of cancellations and manage the spaces that become available in that through the pause placement process. So if you get to your selection time and they don't like what's available, you can always choose not to select and go through the pause process. The pause placement process is a form that they fill out on their housing online, and what happens is then we would go through and look at their forms and assign them still in the deposit or not deposit, in their selection number order. But once we start getting those cancellations, we would do that over the summer. It's definitely a very good option for small groups and individual students. It should be, it's less likely of a space for students in large groups. It's less likely that a lot of cancellations would happen from one large apartment. So it's a good idea if you're going to go into that process to be in a group of 1 or 2. And then those assignments are completed throughout the summer as we process those cancellations. It is important to remember to be patient with that process. We have a lot of success with it. Students are canceling from spaces all over campus, and it means that a lot of different options in different spaces that wouldn't necessarily have been available during your selection time become available. So patience is definitely a good thing, and we will definitely be able to work with you to try to get as close as possible to what you're looking for in that process, as long as you give us a wide range of options and an understanding of where you are based off of your selection number. All right, so selecting a housing option. Students may practice their selection process in the weeks prior. We offer a variety of resources for them starting January 31st. They can practice their selection process on Housing Online. There will be a tutorial for them to walk through how it actually looks. They will also be able to see their vacancies on the vacancy viewer on Housing Online. This shows them a real-time view of what vacancies are available to them, what their options are, and as selection days happen, it removes the options that have already been chosen. We offer several options of students coming into our office and walking through that process, and they can come in and ask questions anytime they like. Additionally, they'll be able to view floor plans on their Housing Online, and from those floor plans and the vacancy viewer, they'll be able to make choices ahead of time of what it looks like would be available to them in their groups and come up with several backup plans. All right, so selecting a housing option, students with a lower number should be the group representative. So if you're in a group of 4 and one of the students has the lowest selection number, they're the ones who would choose housing for the group in the selection process. So the person at that time would log into their Housing Online and pick for the whole group. What the group representative needs would be all of the roommate group's NUID numbers and all of the roommate group PINs. Additionally, you can add roommate groups on your application prior to your selection day, and that would load them in for you. They would also need those NUIDs and group PINs prior to that date as well. You can edit your roommate group in the selection process as well. When it comes to the actual selection day, the student in the group who has the lowest selection number chooses, but they should be planning ahead with the rest of the students in their groups. So what that means, some of the keys for success for a group, for any student in the process, is to understand which halls are available to them and what fits for their group. So the first thing that we ask that they look at is what's available to them. So look at the vacancy viewer and the floor plans and come up with 5 to 10 different options for what would be available for you. Options go very fast in the selection process. So if you've logged in to your group selection time, the faster that you choose during that, it's great. But once you click on something, you have 9 minutes once you're in there to say yes and get the people into the right spaces before you make any final decisions. That is one of the great things about practicing with the practice selection process is you know exactly where to click at the different times and how it's laid out so that you're clicking quickly to figure out where you need to go. We also recommend that you talk with your group about price points. Since one person is selecting for a group, in that case, make sure that all of you are on the same page with what you can all afford. There are a vast difference in housing price ranges, and once you've selected a space, it is locked in for the year or for the semester that you've selected it for. So we want you all to be on the same page to make sure that one person isn't choosing something that the rest of the group can't afford. So a selection number does guarantee you a space in university housing, not necessarily your top preference. So while we do guarantee that you'll be able to have a space, where that will be, it's not necessarily going to be 3 singles in one of the buildings. We don't have many of those options. However, there will be 3 spaces available for the roommates in your group. Where that will be depends on what your peers do and also what's available through different parts of the selection process. If you don't choose to select something in February, March, so if you get to your selection time and you do not like what's available, you don't want to be in a meal plan required building, and you only really want a kitchen and that's where you want to be, that is why pause is for you. Choose not to select and go through the pause process. If you select a room, you are not eligible for the pause process. So it's a better idea to go through the pause process than to choose something that you don't want. So you're going to communicate with your roommates, come to agreement on the price and location and the amenities and group sizes. Another thing to remember there is to come up with a couple options for how your group would break up. So if you're in a roommate group of 4 and you'd also be okay with going through in a group of 2 if there's options of that available during your time. It's a good idea to figure that out before the selection time starts so that you have a good plan of how to break up quickly and form a new group within the time ranges allowed so you don't miss out on some opportunities for that. And again, you can attend info sessions or stop by housing. We're in 4 Spear Commons. And we ask that students ask as many questions as needed so that they are prepared and not surprised by the housing selection. At the end of this, we will have our contact information at the end, and we are very willing to answer any questions anyone has and know that it is a complex process. So as a parent, how can you help? There is a sign up on the parent sign up in the parent portal for the December 12th email. This is the email that the students get to remind them the applications have been posted and with the information on the process. Additionally, students can add you to the parent email opt-in on their Housing Online if you'd like to get some of the deposit reminder emails or some of our other deadlines. Know who will pay the deposits and how. So sometimes we have students who pay the deposit and their parent pays the deposit, and then you have two deposits, or one expects one person to do it and the parent expects the student to have done it and then no one paid it. So it's a good idea to come up with a plan for that beforehand for the upper class students, especially our rising third-year students who did not have to pay a deposit last year. It is a good idea to review with your student what the housing costs you, as a person who pays the bills, likely, are okay with and agree on a price point before selection and hopefully before they talk with their roommate group. Keep an eye on the big picture and help support the students. It's not always in the first part of the process that a student gets it, so help support us with the pause process and the patience in that process. We are very good at assigning students based off of their needs during that part of the process and making sure that they, if you have a housing accommodation for a medical concern, making sure that they are on top of those processes. You can refer to resources to answer questions. You are also more than welcome to ask us questions in housing services. And as an upper class parent, keep the cancellation deadlines in mind. There are cancellation fees associated with canceling housing late if there's a deposit on file. So it's always a good idea to check those out and add those to your calendar. We send reminder emails to students with the cancellation deadlines and with the application deadlines, but having your support in reminding students on that can keep all of us on track as well. So again, our housing website looks like this. You can find more information and more about everything to do with housing on northeastern.edu/housing. The housing application and selection page is under the housing services drop-down and housing application and selection. That has information on all of our different housing application and selection periods, not just for fall and spring. You can find all of the other information there. You can see things about room rates and the different university housing actual options, all gender housing, cancellation deadlines, room changes, anything that you can find there. There is a vast amount of information on that website right at your fingertips. All right.
Well, thank you, Shannon. That was a lot of information. My voice is hurting. You just so we had a parent ask, what is a reading day? And just if we could just repeat the day that the students have to, first-year students have to be out of the residence hall.
You got it. Okay.
Put that slide up again.
Yeah. All right. So a reading day is a day that the university has set aside for students to study for finals. So it's between the end of their classes and the start of exams, so they have a day to catch up on their studying where they're not expected to be in class. And for, for winter break, so that are expected for first-year students to leave by December 13th at 7 p.m., and then the halls reopen by January 5th. And again, if the student needs winter break housing or an arrival or departure change from one of those dates, there's a form available on their Housing Online for them to fill out to make that request.
Okay. Well, at this time, we're going to be taking as many questions as we can, and you can type them in to the right side of your computer screen in the Q&A pod. So, Shannon, can a non-honors student apply to room with a friend who's not in the honors program?
Yes, they can. So the difference is that they wouldn't be able to live in the honors housing. The honors housing is set aside for students who are in the honors program. Unlike in the first year where all honors students are required to live in honors housing, there are additional options available to honors students, but they can only live in it with other honors students. That doesn't stop them from applying for housing and being in a group with non-honors students. They would just choose from the regular pool of housing options.
Okay, so I think we have a lot of first-year families in here, and they're asking a lot of questions about the second year.
Okay, great.
And one of them is, what are some of the housing options for second year, the halls that they could be living in?
Sure. So we don't have the specific ones for next year posted, but on our website under the fall application and selection page, you can see a full list of the breakdown from last year. The majority of the options, so there is a large amount in International Village. It's a hierarchy for housing where the first year students are in traditional and semi-private suites. The second years are in a big mix of semi-private and apartments, and then the upperclassmen are mostly in apartments with some semi-private suites. So for second year students, there's a lot of that semi-private suites, and then there's also a lot of university-owned housing in different price ranges in apartment style options. There might also be some leased properties that it changes every year specifically which ones we put in there. We try to break it down so that there's a good amount of the different types of price points for the different types of students because we want each student group to have the different options based off of price and configuration.
So this kind of applies to second year students too. Parents are asking if their student has a group and they're with another, just say one other student who is a second year student, and one of them goes off to co-op in 2021, it would be. Can they still live in that space?
Yep.
Or what happens if they end up moving to a different city?
Sure. So there are a lot of students who have another student leaving to go on co-op, especially for the spring semester. So if you choose housing for the fall in your group, the people who are staying there would retain the same housing for the spring semester. And the other space for second year students would either be filled by another one of their friends. In some cases, they can pull people in. In most cases, NUN students come back and fill some of those second year spaces. But it is an option in some cases for students to pull in a friend into that new space. It depends at the time. It'll be a process for them. For upper class students, there's a lot of students who choose housing during the selection process and then cancel their housing for the fall in a group. Having someone cancel you out of the group doesn't cancel you out of that space. So again, with the fall, any student who wants to cancel out, once they've picked that housing in the selection process, it is the individual housing assignment for each of those students for the fall semester. And it would become their space for the spring if they're staying there as well. If a student chooses housing during the selection process for the fall and then cancels, it is not then automatically their space for the spring. That space becomes the student who lives there in the fall space for the spring semester, and the student who canceled out of it would go through our spring selection process that happens around this time of year.
So many of our first-year students are living in freshman halls, and we're getting the question of what does a second year, do they same bed, bureau, everything the same?
Yeah, our furniture in the residence halls is pretty similar for their entire time at Northeastern. It would be a twin extra long bed, and then with the dresser and the desk and some shelves. The difference would be if they're in an apartment, they would have some, if they have a living room, they might have a couch and a table or a kitchen table or some chairs. If they live in an apartment and they have a kitchen, a good thing to note is they would not have any kitchen utensils or pots and pans. Those don't carry over from student to student within the space.
You talked a lot about forming groups. It can be a group of 4, it can be a group of 2. What if a student doesn't have someone they want to be a group with? You talked about pause. Can you talk a little bit further than that if a student doesn't have, kind of introverted, doesn't have someone to go with them?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot like how students come in for the fall semester for first-year students or for NUN students coming back now. It's a form where they fill out, they can list their roommate preferences and the types of options that they are, and then a staff member in our office who does those assignments by hand will match them to a roommate based off of what their housing preferences are and what their answers to the roommate quiz are.
You also said that they can practice that selection process. What was the date of that?
Sure. So it'll be posted the same day that they get their selection numbers. So that, let me go forward. That January 31st day, they get a lot of information at once. They'll get their selection numbers and a lot of information on selection times or waitlist numbers if they're a not guaranteed student. And on that date, they'll have a lot of resources that will be available to them, including the practice process. Basically, it's not available until they have selection numbers because you need a selection number in order to participate in the practice.
We had talked about forming groups of 4 and sometimes 2. What are the odds of 5 or 6?
So you can definitely start there. There are less options. I would say some of the more rare ones are along the sides of the largest options, like the 8s. There's very few 7s, if any at all, and there's a very few 3s. But there are 4s and 5s, and there are some 6s. The best way to figure that out for students is to look at their vacancy viewer once it's posted to get an idea of what's available to them. A good thing to remember when looking at the vacancy viewer is that the students only see the rooms that are available to them. So if your student is a female and has opted into gendered housing and not the all-gendered housing, they would only see the rooms available to them in that part of the process. So while their selection number might be something like 3,000 and there's 20 options in 7s or in 6s or something, there are also people at the same selection numbers who are lower than that who are looking at male housing and different options. I know that's confusing.
A little bit from the financial aspect of things. You said that all applications are due by January 17th. What was the deposit they paid? Do you pay that for each semester, or is it just for?
Yep. Okay. So rising second-year students do not pay a deposit. We waive them. So if your student is a first-year student right now, there's no deposit. For the upper class students, there's a $200 deposit for every semester. So the deposit holds housing for those students since they're not required to be here, and that is due by February 10th.
Okay. And if you pay your deposit earlier, does it make a difference than someone who got it in?
No, it doesn't. So the deposit's not available until after selection numbers come out, so it won't affect your selection number at all. The selection numbers are randomly generated prior to the deposit being posted, so that won't affect it. The only thing that would affect it is if you don't pay the deposit, and if you don't pay the deposit by February 10th for fall, your housing might be canceled.
And do students get emails about this?
Many.
These parents say, my student didn't know. So
Absolutely. We send several emails. We'll send several reminder emails about the application beforehand, usually the initial one and then 2 to 3 reminders, and then we'll send 2 or 3 reminders about the deposit deadline as well.
And that deposit goes towards the cost of the room for the
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yep, it's an applied charge at that time.
A question about International Village.
Sure.
Many of them just two people suites. Is there many? I'm not sure how many
Yeah,
are.
so there are some 4-person ones. Those will mostly be for the second-year students, or like this year we have a bunch of students and those that are first-year students. But the vast majority for upperclassmen and for rising second years are 2-person suites, so 2 singles divided by a bathroom.
Okay. We spoke about Lightview, which is our new residence hall.
Yeah.
If students are interested in living in that property, where should they go for that again?
Sure. So there is a welcome center on Columbus Ave. It's right past International Village. There's a little spot right on Columbus Ave for them to go in. Looks like a little wooden building right in front of there. They can go in there and ask questions about it. They can also contact Lightview. There's a link to their website on our website under that housing selection process page in the drop-down bar that we showed at the end. And the representatives there can give them information on the application process and what that would be. For students who are looking at it, it is just for third-year plus students. And we do review eligibility for those to make sure that they are students who are eligible to live there.
Right. I don't know if you have the statistic or not, but do many third and fourth-year students live on campus?
We do. So we have, let's see, third and fourth-year students. So our upper class is, let's see, we have, I don't know specifically how much are living in university housing that are in Boston. It gets a little bit tricky when you're looking at upper class students because so many of them are out of state or on co-op or study abroad, but we do have about 5,000 upper class students living in university housing. So what percentage of that is the number of students who live in Boston right now? that I don't know.
Okay. We have a parent asking about the winter break again. Can students come back earlier than January 5th?
Yes, they can. They'll need to fill out the arrival date change form on their Housing Online.
Okay. I think you answered this too. Someone's asking, what are the housing options for honors for the second-year students? I don't think those buildings have been determined yet, correct?
They haven't been determined yet. Again, you can see what they were for this year in that breakdown on our website of what it was for selection last year. For second-year students this year, it was West Village, some floors of West Village C, and I believe 106 St. Stephen Street. But you can see specifically what those were on there, and then we'll release the housing that's available, how the breakdown is for this year in January.
Okay, so this is a question regarding a transfer student.
Sure.
What is the probability of a transfer student, so it's their second year, but their first semester at Northeastern, getting on-campus housing?
Sure.
And what year are they considered? I know you talked about that.
Yeah, sure. So a transfer student, regardless of their number of years, so you're not guaranteed housing for any of the semesters at Northeastern. So you'd always be a part of the upperclassmen process, so you'd always need to pay deposits if you're offered housing. And so the way that that works is if you're interested in housing, you should apply by the deadline, and then you'll either get a selection number or a wait list number on that January 31st date. And that's determined basically by the interest level of your peers. So how many students have signed up for housing based off of how many students we can offer housing within that part of the process. And we try to get as many of those in as we can. If not, if you apply on time, pretty high on the wait list.
Okay. So I'm a parent of a rising third year who is looking to stay in NU housing with her roommates. When will the listing of what will be available to housing be up on their website?
Yep. Sure, no, that's good. So the breakdown of the buildings will be posted in January, and then the actual vacancy viewer will be available in February.
Okay. You had mentioned that all the students are getting this information and they're getting emails, and I think in the beginning of the presentation you said parents can receive emails, and how do they do that again?
Sure. So the students will always receive more emails than we would send to the parents, but you can opt into the important reminders, the big ones. So you can opt into the application reminder through the parent portal. Let me go towards the end here. Let's see. Yep, so you can sign up on the parent portal for the December 12th email. And then your student can opt you into deposit email reminders and some of our other more major email reminders on their Housing Online by submitting your email through the parent email opt-in option.
We just want to say this to parents that are asking about the winter break. If the students have to leave the building, if we could just repeat that again, what the process for that is, and if they do need temporary housing.
Sure. So for first-year students, most of the buildings close over break. So they're not required to move out. So they can leave all of their things in their room, and they'll get directions from Residential Life closer to that date. And so they close over break, and then they reopen on January 5th. And if they need winter break housing, if your student's an international student, or if they're just looking to stay over break for other reasons, they can fill out the winter break form on their Housing Online, and that form will register them for that winter break housing, and we'll be in contact with them about where that housing would be if they're in a closed building, or if they're in one of the open buildings, that they could just stay in their current space. And I believe that the buildings for winter break are posted on our website on the winter break page. But let's see if I can do them from memory. It is 153 Hemingway, Kennedy, Whitehall, Hastings Hall, International Village, and Spear.
Oh, very good. So someone's asking, my son requires a single due to a disability. Can you talk a little bit about how that process would work?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two important parts of that process. So if it's already approved by the Disability Resource Center, it's already on file, then the student would need to make sure to check yes to having a housing accommodation in their application, and that would register them to either go through a pre-selection process to make sure that they get what they need through that process, or we'll work with them to make sure that they get what they need in selection. If they haven't registered with the Disability Resource Center yet, they would need to both check yes to their having a housing accommodation on their application and register with the Disability Resource Center prior to the application deadline, January 17th.
And a little bit about the deposit too. Is that refundable? Let's say, and is there a date?
Yeah, sure. So each semester has a different cancellation date. So it is refundable it can be transferred as a credit back to the student account or returned to you if a student cancels by the cancellation deadline. So for summer 1, that's March 15th. For summer 2, it's April 15th. For fall, it's May 15th, and for spring, it's October 1st. Those deadlines are on our website, so they can cancel for any reason up to that date on their housing online and receive that deposit back. After that deadline, it is still refundable to be returned as a credit to you. If the student is going on a co-op outside of Boston and can be confirmed, if they're taking a medical leave, if they withdraw from the university, there's several different options there, but they just requires a couple extra steps where we need confirmation from different offices within the Northeastern community in order to get that back.
I think this is a really good question. If a group of 4 don't see any viable options when they go to do it, should they quickly go to a 2 group, or what would you suggest for them to do?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. So that's when it's very useful to have also looked at the options for groups of 2. So be prepared with what your options would be for that group of 2, and don't break up that group if you already know the options that you'd be looking for in your group of 2 are already gone. So if you've prepared several options beforehand and you're looking at that vacancy viewer on your day of, they can see what options are for 4s, and if they get in there and they're not seeing what they were looking for 4s, don't panic and undo it on that time. Have someone looking at that vacancy viewer, and if it's not available what you're looking for, your best option is to go through the pause process. Don't pick something that you don't want, and then to give us the most detail in that pause form that you can. So in a pause form, there's a comments box, and you can go into that form with a group of 4. And what I would recommend doing in that form is then in that comments box giving us all of the information in the ways that you would split up and what options you would want within a split up group. And that gives us the most ability to work with you as we process cancellations. And as someone who's done pause placement before, it's so much easier to do it if we understand more questions, more ideas of how the students want for that groups of 2 if they do have to break up, and if we can't keep that group of 4. So if it's not available for either option in that selection time, go through the pause process.
So we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. This is another excellent question. How difficult is it for a current 3rd year living off campus to come back if they decide to come back?
Sure.
Well, but I'm thinking about the deadline, so they have to make sure they reach that deadline.
So I guess it depends whether or not they were accepted as a traditional student. So if they came in as a regular freshman in the fall or through the NUN program and they're not a transfer student and they're guaranteed housing, by choosing to live off campus for a semester or for a year, that doesn't remove their guaranteed housing status in the future. So if a student's lived off campus for their 3rd year, they finished their housing requirement, they lived off campus for their 3rd year and they want to come back for their 4th, they just need to follow the application and deposit deadlines for the new terms and they would still be guaranteed housing. No harm, no foul.
So for summer 1 and 2, 2020, are the deadlines, how I know you said you still want to do the deadlines in the January date, but how flexible are those if you decide later in the semester?
Pretty flexible. Yeah, exactly. For the summer terms, we very rarely reach capacity, so you can apply for those later. You could pay your deposits later for those. That's not a problem. What I would recommend knowing if you're going to wait on those is to understand when the housing selection processes for those times happen, so you can see the processes and the timelines for summer 1 and summer 2 housing selection on our website, the general time of year that those happen. It's a good idea if you think you're going to need it to apply anyway. At least apply and you don't have to pay the deposit, so you get the emails about the terms. If you don't, you can always apply and not deposit and pay a deposit later, but you can't You wouldn't get any information about that semester if you don't apply. But if you want to wait on all of that, know when the selection process is. If you sign up after the selection process, the options available during that term are much less available. So you'd be placed into whatever's still left after those selection processes, or you might not be able to stay in your same space. So moral of the story is apply for all of the terms, and then if you want to hold them waiting on paying a deposit, that's the thing to hold on.
Okay, so one final question, and I believe you already answered this one. Can student groups be co-ed?
Yes, they can.
Yep.
They just have to all make sure that they sign and say yes to the all-gender agreement.
Okay. I do want to mention to everybody that we will be emailing you this presentation and a copy of the slides. That will be available to you probably early next week on Monday. At this time, we've asked you to complete our survey on tonight's webinar. If your question did remain unanswered, and I know there were a lot of questions and we may not have gotten to a lot of them, some of them were personal about your student and we would love to answer those, we do encourage you to email us at parents@northeastern.edu, and I will be sure to forward them on to our housing office tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. We have one more Tuesday talks, I believe December 3rd, and we are going to be talking about off-campus housing. Shortly, we are going to provide you with a brief survey for some feedback on tonight's session. Please take a few minutes to complete it and suggest any topics that you would like to see us do in the future. Thank you again for joining us, and I'd like to thank Shannon for taking time out of her schedule at this busy time of year. And we look forward to talking to you all soon. Thank you.